Good evening. Welcome to one of the last workshops of the 2012-2013 series for the business plan competition. Delighted to see so many people here tonight. I'm John Rollins, that's who I am, and although it's probably more relevant for you to know that I'm a serial entrepreneur. I started my first business 2 months after I got out of school many years ago. I've had 4 startups. One of them didn't make it. We closed it down, but the other 3 had pretty good exits. So I started teaching here in 2001 and taught the Entrepreneurship course here in the School of Business for up until 2 years ago. And the reason I stopped teaching is because 5 years ago I started this business plan competition, and it's now become a year-round event with workshops like this starting in September and then going right up until the end of the year with all the follow-on activities after we hand out the checks at the end of April in the final round. That's who I am, but I want to know a little bit about who you are. How many of you are here because you're on one of the 35 teams that's moving on to the semifinals? Almost everybody. That's great. Who's not moving on to the semi? Okay, we've got a couple of people. Why are you here? I'm curious.
I actually work here at GW. I'm in the development office.
You're in development. Good.
About a month ago, started thinking about some really crazy ideas, and I want to see if they're actually good and how I can move forward. So I saw an email and figured out.
This works, and I just talked to this gentleman. He's involved in a startup. Because anytime you're starting a new business, you need to put your ideas down in writing in the form of a business plan. That doesn't mean that it's immutable. You can do pivots along the way. 2.7 pivots is about the average for any startup, and that means you change your business plan when you pivot. You make some radical change, and that's fine. You can do that, but you need to reflect it all the way through your business plan in all the sections of the plan that we're going to be talking about tonight. Just a quick word about entrepreneurship. As you may know, it's the #1 most popular course of study, fastest growing in all the colleges and universities across the country. And the reason for that is people like to start new businesses. Almost 3/4 of Americans have thought about starting a new business, just like you all have. That doesn't mean they necessarily will, or you necessarily will, but people think about it. It's very much the American thing to do because it's so important to our economy. Over half of our private gross domestic product, GDP, comes from entrepreneur-led small businesses. But probably the more important statistic, and we've had so much talk the last couple of years about jobs and unemployment in this country, the most important thing is that almost all the new jobs created in our economy, permanent new jobs, not the temporary ones, repairing something and then you get unemployed after you finish the repair job, but the permanent ones come from entrepreneur-led small businesses. In fact, there was a study that came out from the Kauffman Foundation last year that covered many decades of history in this country, and it showed that in the first 12 months the companies are in business, they hire as many people every year as there are hired in the whole U.S. economy in that year, new jobs. So they account for 100% of the net new jobs, as it's put, in our economy. So it's really dramatic. And that's why we need more of these. And then on innovation, if you divide up all the businesses like our Commerce Department does into small, medium, and large, the small ones generate 13 times as many innovations per capita as the big businesses do. Makes sense. I mean, you've come up with ideas for your new business, but these statistics are compelling. What is a business plan? That's a definition up there. But I guess the important thing is what do you do with it? And there are really 2 main uses. Your use within your new business, where it becomes a roadmap, a set of projections, a bunch of plans as to where you're going to go that you can measure yourself against later as you update your plan, and you will be updating it probably at least once a year as you go forward with your new business. But it's also needed if you're going to get outside funding. The investors need it, your bankers. If you want to apply to be in an incubator downtown here in DC, they're going to want to see your business plan. So there are a lot of outside uses too. But I actually think there's a third use that's not in the textbooks, and that is that by the time you finish writing your plan, you'll be convinced that you either do or don't want to start this business. It's sort of a reality check. I mean, by the time you go through how much capital you need to raise and who you need to hire and what you have to put into designing a marketing plan and getting your product launched, you'll either be so excited because you know it's going to work, or you may be scared off by the reality check. And so a business plan really serves that purpose too. I'm going to talk for a minute specifically about the structure of the business plans that you're going to write for the semifinal entry in the competition. And all this is really spelled out in the GWBizPlan.com rules /rules website. Well, it's right there on that bullet. So there are certain sections that are required. There's 7 of them, and we're going to go through those 7 tonight. But 15 pages of text is the maximum, and then 5 additional pages maximum of appendices. And of course, you have to abide by all the rules about Arial, font, and 1-inch margins, same kind of stuff you did in the first round. But I think it's more important in this round because if you don't use the right font and the right margins and all that stuff, and my assistant goes through and changes yours, there's more chance you're really going to get screwed up in this round than it did in the first round. He said a number of the plans that were submitted in the first round didn't follow those rules. And when he changed it to follow the Arial 12 and all the detailed rules, some of them went a few lines over the 2 pages, but not enough to be hazardous, I don't believe, for anybody, because you're all here. I also recommend that the look and feel of the document be sharp, but not too flashy. The judges are going to be reading these, and I'm not one of those judges, like to read for substance. And flash is not really that high on their list of things that impress them. Just a couple of red flags quickly. I'm going to talk fast as we go through this, but if you do have questions, interrupt me because it's easier to cover them now if your question is about the topic we're discussing than if we have to come back to it at the end. I mentioned I started my first business 2 months after I got out of school. I'd just gotten an MBA, and I paid all the tuition, room, and board for it, and I was almost broke. But I had $2,000 to my name total, and that's in today's dollars, not 19 whatever dollars back when this happened. But I offered to put that $2,000 into the new business when I was raising $500,000 for a new software company, and I think people were impressed that I did that. But it is sort of a red flag if you don't have some skin in the game yourself in some way, shape, or form. Question?
Could you talk a little bit about the makeup of the judges? Is there a demographic profile? Yeah,
the judges are all experienced entrepreneurs. A few of them are more on the investment side, but most all of them have been involved in startups at some time or other themselves and survived. So they're really proven entrepreneurs. They're all people I know here in the community. I've lived here, as I say, since I got out of graduate school, and so I know a lot of people.
Yeah. Is there a mix of men and women, or is
yes?
Okay.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Defining the market size too broadly is a common problem. People often say, "Well, my product, I can sell it to everybody in the world." that means I'll sell, if I only sell 1%, real conservative, I only sell 1%, that'll be 70 million sales in the first year. Population 7 billion on the planet. Well, that's defining your product a little too broadly. You obviously never do that. Thank you. Actually, the fact that you've made it this far to the semifinals means you've really passed the first feasibility screen. But in fact, the first question of the 4 that the judges looked at, and you know what the criteria were in round 1, because all these criteria are right on the website, is the idea a new, creative, innovative idea? And so, obviously, you don't want to come up with an old idea that you're trying to retread for something like this. You want something that's genuinely creative. Same thing with the industry you're going after. If you're going after print media as opposed to, say, social media, I mean, their judges are going to say, well, print media is dying. Social media is where the action is, online media, that sort of thing. So you want to be in a rapidly growing area. I think these are all pretty self-explanatory. I'm going to skip right through that. In fact, I'm going to skip Porter's 5 forces too. This gets a little bit technical, but Michael Porter is a professor at Harvard B School and a real guru on entrepreneurship. He's come up with more useful advice for entrepreneurs than any single person I know. And one of them is to take a look at the industry they're becoming a part of and look at what the forces are on that industry and decide if it's an attractive industry. And these 5 forces really measure the attractiveness of any given industry. Like, you know, well, I won't give you any examples because I might hit on one of your companies, but question?
Yeah. So I'm wondering, are you trying to, do you want us to include a Porter's 5 forces analysis inside the plan? And also, would you like to include a first feasibility screen? Is that a section that you're looking for?
Not necessarily. I think it's important you go through these things and only include in your plan the things that reflect well on your new idea and your new business, because you want the judges to be impressed.
Okay.
But if you haven't thought of these things, I'm putting them up here really to call them to your attention. They're all topics that are discussed in this little Bruce Ballinger book that we recommend on our website. There are a lot of good books on writing business plans, but this one happens to be in the bookstore, and it's a bestseller in the United States on how to write a business plan, so we make that available. And, a lot of this material is covered in the Ballinger book. You can even get the ebook version of it. You don't have to get the hard copy version. You can get it on Amazon or wherever you want to get it. But no, I'd be surprised if anybody had Porter's 5 forces in their business plan. Although if it really put you in a good light to talk about those 5 things and how they show that your business is going to soar, go ahead.
Okay.
But you should do some feasibility analysis when you're looking at your industry. I always start with secondary research, which is on the web or in a library or someplace like that where you're learning as much as you can about the industry you're going to be part of. But beyond that, I recommend you get into some primary research, which is actually talking to people who are customers, who are already in the industry that may be competitors. You might be able to go undercover and learn more now than you could later once you're competing with that particular firm that's in the same space that you're going into. But let me tell you, the best source of information is to talk to customers. Find out who they're buying from, who's out there, what's wrong with the products in the space right now, and get them to give you some pointers on how you can tailor your service or your product to really be fantastic. In fact, you'll do that all the time you're in business. You're always learning from your customers because the world doesn't stand still. You have to reinvent it over and over again. That first company I started two months out of graduate school, I reinvented 5 times over a 30-year period before I did an exit. And that's just part of life in a small business because the world keeps changing and technology keeps changing. Okay, the 7 sections that are required in your business plan are these. And I'm going to touch on each one of these 7 in the presentation, but I'm going to spend more time on number 3, 4, and 7 because I think they're the ones that really you would benefit most from doing a terrific job in terms of impressing the judges. In other words, talking about your strategies in section 3, your marketing plan in number 4, and then the financial, which is number 7. I'm curious, who wants to guess which of these sections the judges are probably going to read first when you hand your plan to them? Financial? Good guess. Anybody else have another guess?
Section 3.
Section 3, the strategy? Yeah, they might. Anybody, any other guesses?
4.
Well, those are the 3 I'm going to emphasize. You guys are pretty quick. Actually, I think most of them will probably read the executive summary first, just to get an overview, which is what you expect. But what about an investor? Now, I'm not talking about a judge now. Somebody that you approach that wants to invest. Yeah, that's where the investor. They always flip to the back to the charts in the appendix. I've done that a few times. So you understand the priority. Let's talk about each one sort of real quickly here, and you can ask me questions as we go through them. This one should not be more than 2 pages long, as you do want to keep it short. And it'll be different than the executive summary you've already written, because this one requires what? A mission statement. There were no mission statements required in the first one. And of the ones I've looked at so far, I didn't see any mission statements. Doesn't count against you if you did put it in the first one, but you have to have a short mission statement in this one. I'd say the most important thing to remember in writing this is to include information from all 6 of the other sections, because this is a summary of the entire document. So you want to touch on everything in there. And you want to touch most heavily on the things that favor you. If it's your team and your experience and your background, your unique personal capabilities, touch on that a little bit more. If it's your marketing plan, touch or your strategy, whatever it is. I really recommend you emphasize the things that are in your favor. In fact, you've got 15 pages, not counting the appendices. 15 divided by 7. You got 2 pages for each section, plus 3 pages for one of them, right? So that 3-pager should be on the one that is your strength. That's my advice. Okay, second section. In fact, you may want to wait until you've written all the other sections before you write the executive summary. Or I should say rewrite, because you've already got a good executive summary. That's what got you to this round. But you'll probably want to rewrite it, include your mission statement. You'll probably have some other things you've thought of that you want to emphasize because you've just written sections 2 through 7. Industry and company overview is just that. You got to talk about the industry and you got to talk about your company. And it's important in talking about the industry not to ignore any negative stuff, because if the judges know there's an elephant in the room, a negative thing. Like say your product is delivered, it's fast delivery through the Postal Service. You know, the old Netflix, the way they started, everything was through the Postal Service. Everybody knows that this summer, the Postal Service is going from 6 days a week to 5 days a week on mail delivery. That's the elephant in the room. You got to you got to talk about those kinds of things. Hopefully you don't have too many of those, but if there are any negatives about your industry or what's going on or trends, why your company and your product or service addresses those. And in describing the industry, you can use a little chart. This happens to be the semiconductor industry growth. Nice high growth industry over that 5-year period. industries, is it a concentrated industry with just 2 or 3 big players? Or is it a fragmented industry with hundreds, thousands of players? In fact, which would you prefer to go into as an industry with your new business you're starting? One that's concentrated or one that's fragmented? Fragmented sounds easier, doesn't it? Yeah. Although you may have an angle where you can, when I started my first business, my only competitor was IBM. And IBM charged so much for their processing services 40 years ago when I started that first business that I could come in way under what they called the IBM price umbrella, because it was a big umbrella up here. So I could start a business that was under that and do fine by specializing in a particular niche industry, which I did. What's described here is really Porter's 5 forces. If you read these things, the attractiveness of the industry. Guy's a genius. And then lastly, you want to include in here stuff about your product or service, specifically, as opposed to the industry. And what is your unique selling proposition? We talked about elevator pitches earlier and how you can have a quick explanation of what your business is. Me, my doc. Where's Ruby? Is Ruby here? She was going to give an example of a unique selling proposition. But what you submitted to go on the BizPlan website is a description of your company. Okay? And that's different than a unique selling proposition is from the customer's perspective. Why do they want to buy your product or service? A little bit different angle. Let me pick one of these. I have the ones that you submitted that are on the website. Is Vanessa here?
Right.
Yeah. You could probably give me a good unique selling proposition. I'll read Vanessa's business description about Greenies. Greenies is a website and a subsequent app that will allow customers to locate restaurants, cafes, bakeries, and grocers that source from local farms and or serve sustainable cuisine. Great, one-sentence description. But that's not why somebody would buy it or use it. So can you give me a unique selling proposition about why you want me to buy your app? What does it do for me?
Well, if you're vegan, you have a very particular, cuisine that you can eat. You can't eat any meat or animal byproduct, and a lot of vegans don't know where to go.
Just got to keep this short.
Okay, so I guess looking for the food that you want when you want it, or if you're somebody who wants to contribute to the local living economies, cares about the freshness of their food, or cares about the environment, this would be the app for you.
Good. And I can use the app to find a restaurant, cafe, bakery, or grocer that sells what I'm looking for. That's really the bottom line. With Greenies app, you, Professor Rollins, can find a restaurant, cafe, bakery, or grocer to serve sustainable cuisine as you desire that's sourced from local farms. Boom. So that's the USP. How are you going to sell it? And the important thing about having a USP is that, and we'll talk about this later in the marketing section, is that becomes the foundation for all your advertising and promotions going forward. You have to carefully craft it, get exactly the right words, colorful adjectives or adverbs, whatever, and then use that to sell your product. Yeah?
So when it comes to you have a, say, unique technology, how detailed do you have to explain
You might scare them off if you get too detailed. You want to describe it in terms of benefits, not features. A lot of people get stuck on the features, and it's just the benefits, like Vanessa was telling me about, it's the benefit to me is I can find the food I want, sustainably sourced locally. That's all I care. I don't want all the details behind that. And if you're developing a product, it's important that you disclose how far along you are in the development of it. Do you just have working drawings, or do you have a prototype, or is it in alpha testing? Is it in beta testing? How far along where are you toward launching your live product? Are you? Okay, that ends that section on the industry and the company. Now let's get into strategy, which is one of my 3 favorites. And I'm going to talk about really each of these bullets on here. There are 3 strategies that are generally considered best practices for new businesses. And again, Michael Porter came up with these 3, and everybody agrees that they're just these 3. The first one is to be a Walmart or a McDonald's and have really cheap products. Generally, you don't start out that way. I don't recommend this first one at all. But the other 2 are great. I want to talk about them for a minute. The second one is a unique product, and the third one is a unique niche market. Very different approaches. A unique product like Apple, shiny, sexy, neat products, but they're for anybody that wants them. But in the third strategy, it's a unique market where you're really going into a niche market that you can know more about than anybody because you've defined it and carved it out so carefully. My first company I started was a database application company, and so you take all the database products. Then I decided to focus on nonprofits because there are a lot of those here around the Washington area. And then within non-products, I segmented it down to those that have members. Generally, they go by the word associations. And I became the first specialized association software company in the world, just by defining a niche market. And it turns out associations are the second largest industry in Washington, D.C. So I had first mover advantage, and the company, it was all based on a strategy that seemed to make sense and ultimately worked out. So you got to define it. Netflix is in the entertainment business, but then you segment that down to movies, and then you segment that down to movies watched at home. Okay, now you've got Netflix in this little corner down here. Entertainment, movies watched at home. And you can go through this jigsaw puzzle if you want. If that whole jigsaw puzzle is entertainment, and movies are the bottom tier across here, and movies watched at home are this piece here. Okay, that's how you do a focus strategy for your business. And that's how Netflix has been successful. And it's an iterative process. As you select it, you go through it. You may estimate the size of the market and maybe too small, or maybe too big. You can't handle it. It's too much. So you can change your focus. You can narrow it. You can widen it. Then you iterate. Try again. Redefine it. Run the numbers again. Maybe you want to keep a geographic focus in the early stages of your business. So it's just the Washington metro area to begin with. And then later, as you're ready to expand and get more capital, then you become regional, then you become national, then you become global. But it's a good way to start with a focus, so you can really dominate your niche market when you're starting out.
Yeah, a question.
Question.
About the market. I'm thinking about growing by some kind of intelligence reports business. They're kind of expensive. It's $3,000, $4,000. give us the data for 2012 or even 2013.
Mm-hmm.
How long could be acceptable for the judges to get this data?
How long could be what?
5 years old, 10 years.
Before you buy that system?
No, to refer to the data that we are taking for the project. Or say something if I'm gonna say some prices. So for X or Y, I have to pay $3,000 or $4,000. Forget the prices for 2013.
Mm-hmm.
Just a hypothesis. But I found a data that you need that prices that is for 2005. That could be acceptable, or has to be something 2 years old, or no more than 2 years old.
You've got to use your judgment as to what you think is valid data that you can rely on to do that. I don't think there's a single answer to your question. Lot of things in business, you make decisions based on less than perfect information, and it's really better to make a decision even if you only have 80% of the data necessary than to struggle for another month to get the last 20%, because you've got to make decisions and move forward when you're an entrepreneur in a small business, and you can never have perfect information. You just have to make it based on your gut feel and the information you have at hand. Yeah, in the back.
What's the difference here between segmenting the market and selecting the target market? Because you have here it says breaks the industry into specific segments and specifies a segment or target market that the firm will tackle. Now on the next slide it says once a firm segments its market, it selects a segment within the market to tackle. I'm not really understanding what that means.
But really, it's the same thing. When you segment, you divide it so you can focus on a particular subset or segment, and that becomes your target. It's really the same. This is really a continuum of the previous slide.
Okay, that sounds good.
Another question? Yeah.
I actually have a question about the previous slides. It's about how far along is the company in the, what about if we didn't form the company, we just came up with the idea?
Sure.
So the time, we're not sure about the time, how far along such a thing
Well,
like that.
then you want to explain that where you are in your product development is you have a design on paper. Or you know, and you can show sketches. Is it a product or a service?
Yeah, it is. It is service.
It's a service. Okay, well that's even easier because you don't have to have a prototype. If it's a service, you just describe the service and the market you're going into, and then we'll talk about competitors next because you need to really spend some time on who else is delivering the same service that you're going to compete with. That's good. Segue into this slide. How do you find out who your competitors are? Have you done that yet? Have you gone around and talked to any competitors?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this may be a big one on this part. Is
Sure.
that talking to your competitors but not acting like a competitor at the same time. Look kind of sneaky.
Well, you can do secondary research. You're talking about primary, which I recommend you do some primary. But you can also talk to customers as opposed to the competitors themselves. If you can find out who the competitor's customer is, you might feel better talking to them to find out what they like and don't like about that competitor's product or service. Yeah?
Just along that vein, I reached out to when you were saying that as a student working on a project or something.
That's a great way to do it. Use the cover of being a student.
I mean, I'm saying that I'm working on a potential business plan, but I say it's for a school project. And
There you go.
If they don't want to talk to me, they won't, but at least for me.
That opens lots of doors.
And Google's actually really huge too. I mean, I was curious how Foursquare made money, how Yelp made money, so I just Googled how does Foursquare make money. And Forbes had like an entire article on it.
Forbes had an article?
Yeah, Forbes had an article. I think something like
That's
two
good.
other articles on it. So
Yeah, Business Week often has articles on stuff like that.
Full question to Google. You'd be surprised if it's out there. Yeah.
That's good. But you got to do some digging, and you don't want to talk about just the direct competitors, but there may be substitute products, which are called indirect competitors. So if you're thinking of starting a sushi restaurant, you really want to look at maybe all the Asian restaurants as being competitors or something like that, because there's a substitution factor in there too. The hardest one is to look at future competitors. Although you can do that, the fourth company I started was a streaming video company in a very small niche market of providing e-learning online for continuing education applications. And so I considered potential future competitors being anybody that was doing online education, not just in my niche, which was the adult continuing education for professionals, real niche, but anybody doing online e-learning. So, and you got to look at where they are and whether they have the potential to come in and become a competitor. You're not going to fit all this into your 15-page business plan, but it's stuff to think about. And you may have something that's really valuable that you're able to include in your plan that would sway the judges. They think, wow, they've really, thought about this, and obviously you're very sophisticated in their market analysis. Okay, let's go to number 4, the marketing plan, the second of my areas I want to emphasize. I'm going to go through these things in about 5 slides here. Starting with the positioning. Take an example of electric cars. There's a picture of a car there. Tesla, Nissan Leaf, Chevy Volt. Very, very different markets, even though they're all electric cars. I mean, Tesla costs what, $100,000 more? Yeah. But they're all plug-in electrics. Tesla is the most expensive by far, by an order of magnitude, really, over the other two. Nissan, on a charge, you can get 100 miles plus. Chevy Volt, maybe 40 miles. And then you got to start pumping gas and using the gas engine if you're going to be more than 40 miles. So different markets. So if you're selling it to people that live in Foggy Bottom, maybe 40 miles is enough. So that's a target. If you're selling it to people that live in Stamford, Connecticut, you might want to sell the Tesla. High end. Fairfield County, Connecticut is one of the 5 top counties in the country on income. So you got to position your product or service with who your buyer is, how you're going to do it. I don't have to go through this with the Starbucks market. Everybody understands that product. So you got to think about your competitive advantage and how that positions you in the marketplace for your marketing. We already talked about USP, which I call a value proposition. It's from the customer's point of view. But the important thing to remember about the USP is that you got to use it. You want to use it in all your advertising and all your PR, all your publicity. You want to be consistent so that your image that you're communicating to your potential customers is consistent every place it appears. So you don't keep describing it in different words, different places. Sometimes there's a tagline that you put with your product or service, and that tagline appears everywhere, and that sort of does the description for you. Question?
How often would you say that the USP is fine-tuned?
How often would I do what?
Planning process. How often would you say the USP is kind of fine-tuned over the course?
Oh, you're constantly fine-tuning it. In fact, every time you pivot, you got to fine-tune it again, and you're going to be doing some pivots in your business. Is changing your product or your approach or something about it as you learn more. But in communicating with your customers and your prospects, I guess my advice would be to minimize the number of times you change that USP, or particularly the tagline, because that you're trying to imprint on their brains, and so you don't want to change it very often. Pricing is really not given as much emphasis as it should be, I think, by most new businesses. and the tendency is to price your product too cheap. You tend to be cost-based, and being cost-based ends up being a real mistake because, well, I take that back. If you're selling consulting services, it probably makes sense to be cost-based because you can figure out that if your consultants that are you're paying $75 an hour to, and you're charging $150, you can cover their overhead out of that other 75 or something. So you can be sort of use a multiple of what the cost is to come up with the price. But for any other business, which includes almost every other business plan I've read, you really should follow the value-based approach, which is going to the marketplace and seeing what the highest price is you can charge, okay, and still make sales. And you want to start higher rather than starting lower, because you can always lower a price, but you can very, very seldom raise it. So it's better to start on the high side and position it more as a high quality, more of a luxury type product, and then you can lower it later if you need to. But it's a good way to start out. But I'll always use the valued approach. And the way you arrive at that is you get input from customers, from users, from whoever your buyers are. In fact, the chapter in the Behringer book on pricing is excellent. I'd recommend that if you're struggling over how to price your product or service. Which do you think works better, advertising or public relations in terms of increasing your sales? PR? Certainly costs less. PR costs nothing, actually. It's sweat equity. You got to do some work to put it together, to write a press release or to get an article in a newspaper or magazine that's being read by your target market. Advertising could be very expensive, and some people view advertising as being a bribe or something, because they know people have to pay a lot. $4 million for every 30 seconds in the Super Bowl. We all learned that a couple of weeks ago. You think, wow, those people really have a lot of $4 million budgets. A lot of ads there. Anybody have any experience in the trade-off between PR and advertising you want to share? Yeah.
I did. I worked for startup companies, and we usually started with PR. I've done tests where we've done advertising and PR, and when you track the ROI, we got a much quicker return on the public relations than we did on the advertising. Advertising really started to kick in after the brand was established. Mm-hmm. It didn't really necessarily create it or kick sales off. It did help if we did something that was a call to action, and it helped create the lead funnel, but PR was more effective in general at filling our pipeline.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, PR is more consistent with what we call guerrilla marketing, which is getting out there and getting your product accepted without spending anything. I'm reminded of when Red Bull first started, they didn't have much budget at all, and their guerrilla marketing technique was to order millions of empty cans and then open them and then just leave them around on windowsills, trash cans, all over campuses, all over wherever their target markets were across the country. Empty cans. They never did have any product in them, but people would see them, and what would they think?
Drink it.
Somebody drank that. Boy, this is catching on. A lot of empty Red Bull cans on windowsills and trash cans, and trunk lids of cars. Where I don't know where they put them, but it worked. They really got a brand overnight. That's called guerrilla marketing, and that's not advertising. That's just thinking and working smart.
Creative promotion.
We're on to sales cycle. this may be an important thing for you to mention, maybe not, but the sales cycle is how many prospects on the top line does it take to get one customer on line 6 where you close the sale. It's called a funnel in the marketing world. And if you need 10 prospects, and then in step 3, out of those 10, 5 of them are qualified. In other words, they have the necessary, they have a budget approved, they have the right characteristics to buy the product, and then finally you close the sale at number 6. I'm thinking of big products. I mean, I sold $100,000 software systems in my company, and so you'd always try and find markets where you could get a funnel that would close down fairly quickly, so you wouldn't have to talk to 1,000 prospects to get one customer, that kind of thing. So it's called the sales cycle. And then once you close the sale, there's obviously a lot of follow-up that comes on after that, but that's one piece of the marketing. And the last piece of marketing, and it's interesting because marketing covers so much stuff, is distribution. How you deliver the product is part of marketing. Going back to my Netflix example, they were delivering it through the Postal Service where they get this one-day delivery that they'd set up with the post office where they could mail the DVD out, and the very next delivery day you would have it in your mailbox. And a lot of people still get their Netflix that way, but now they changed from having the warehouses and trucks full of DVDs to doing everything over the web with streaming. So it's different product today, but distribution is an important part of the whole marketing plan. So marketing really covers quality, whether you're a luxury product or a low price product, whatever. It's quality, convenience, innovation, service, high service, low service, whatever, and speed of delivery. So all of those things really, I mean, marketing is a big section of the description of how you're going to win with your new business. Let me go on to the 5th of the 7 sections, which is operations. And this is what I won't spend too much time on, because a lot of people think operations is sort of dull and back office and manufacturing and stuff like that, which it is in some cases. If you're into manufacturing, this slide is important. You've really got to cover information about your production cycle and inventory and bottlenecks and seasonal production loads, all these things. But on the other hand, if you're not producing something, it may not be important. That's why I'm not going to emphasize this section. Or if you're a retail establishment, a restaurant, or anything like that, you want to talk about location. So that becomes an important part of this this whole section of your proposal, of your business plan, I should say. If you're a retail operation. And the other case where this is important is if you're developing a new product. We talked before about explaining where you are in the development cycle, whether it's just a plan on paper or whether you have a prototype or alpha testing, beta testing, where you are in the whole cycle. So if you're designing a new product or service, it's important in this section of your business plan to talk about where you are in that cycle. Oh, and then one more really important thing is intellectual property. If there's any aspect of your business that needs to be protected, this is important to give at least a couple of sentences to. I guess any business should worry about its trademark, or service mark as it's called in the case of a service. Patents and trademarks, including service marks, come from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, uspto.gov. It's a wonderful website. You can look at all the ones that are out there and apply and get yours approved and that sort of thing. It's got to be unique, etc. But probably the most important is the first one, the patent. So if you've got a product that's patentable, you really need to think about the kind of protection you're going to get. And it's expensive to get a patent. From my experience recently, it's been over $20,000, sometimes as much as $40,000, to get a full utility patent through the USPTO process. It could take years. I had one I submitted that I didn't hear back for 6 years after I submitted it. I mean, it's just scary that, you know, so many, they're getting deluged with all these over in Northern Virginia. But it's important to get that protection, and you don't have to go all the way. You can get a provisional patent very inexpensively. And in fact, if anybody makes it to the point that you're going to be presenting in the finals of the business plan competition, you really need to have your provisional patent application in before you make a, quote, public disclosure. And that would be a so-called public disclosure if you're in the finals of our GW, business plan competition. And if you're in that category, let me know, because we've got an attorney that is a GW alum who offers sort of free consultations on provisional patent applications. Peter Weissman with Blank Rome. Blank Rome is one of our sponsors, and he'd like to meet with you and help you on a pro bono basis, just to kind of make sure you get the protection you need in the form of a provisional before you present it. Because it turns out there's now a rule that if you go for an international patent that covers you all around the world instead of just the U.S., you are required to have applied for a provisional patent before you make that first public disclosure. It's required. The lawyers are winning. It's getting more complicated. Copyrights you get from the Library of Congress. That's on works of authorship. You know, music, plays, any written item, even computer software can be copyrighted. But the fourth one, and this is really probably the most valuable in a way, are trade secrets. Who can tell us what trade secrets are? In the back?
The recipe to Papa John's pizza?
Yeah, or the recipe to Coca-Cola. You said Papa John's pizza, but yeah, there are a lot of secrets out there that they just keep the recipe locked up in a safe somewhere, and there are only 2 people that know the combination of the safe, or whatever, however it is, some control over it. So it's a trade secret. It's got to be the kind of product that's hard to analyze, you know, like Pepsi here, by any chemical analysis. So you can't really reverse engineer it with in a chem lab. The trade secrets work well. Remember the first modem product that was ever developed back in the 70s was from a company, and all they did was do a trade secret on it. Nobody could figure out how it worked. And that way they weren't limited to 20 years like you are on a patent. Any questions on intellectual property? It's an important topic. It helps build a moat around your company so that other companies can't steal what you know. That's your intellectual property. You own that trademark or the patent on that invention. Yeah?
So at what point can you apply for a provisional patent? I mean, if you have an actual prototype or if you have like the designs for the prototype?
All you need is the design. Oh, that's a good question for Peter Weissman, actually. Get the lawyers involved here, but I think all you need is the design.
Yeah, what I did, I actually am working through that process right now. I have the Smart Brush.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So right now I'm actually going through that process, and all they require is a description and sketches, or get CAD designs. You can submit that. So I'm
great. That's a neat product. I enjoyed reading your plan. Management team.
John.
Question?
Yeah, regarding the patent, if you already apply, can you just write them as pending patents? Or?
Yes, once you've submitted your application, you can put patent pending on your product, on the sticker. And that scares people away, patent pending. Or it should scare people away because you're ahead of them, in other words. In other words, we just switched in this country from first to invent, which is the old way we used to do patents. It's now called first to file. So even if somebody else invented it, but they haven't filed yet, you can file, and you can get it. Doesn't seem fair, but we just switched because the international standard is all first to file. So now we're following that standard.
That actually happens on March 16th. So
yeah.
if you get that provisional patent in, you'll be first to invent.
Got to get it in the next 32 days.
There you go.
How do you know if you need a patent though?
If it's something that you've invented that's worth protecting, that's the answer.
Even if it's a mobile application or software.
Oh really?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What if we've got like, you'd need a provisional patent? You couldn't do like say, we've already applied for the trademark. That wouldn't.
Well, trademark is trade. That's the brand. That covers the brand, but not the product itself. Somebody could use that same product and call it by a different name or brand and copy you. Okay, let's talk for a minute about Section 6. And there really are a couple of things you want to put in here. Two screens. One is the team, what your experience is, what success you've had, what your educational background is, that sort of thing. Why you're qualified is really all the judges are looking for. And then the second thing would be any advisors or other professionals that are really important, that stand out, that make you, in the eyes of the judges, look like you're going to be a better chance of succeeding than a company without those advisors or professionals. In fact, going forward, I recommend most the companies have boards of advisors, and actually they're made up usually of customers. In my software businesses, I would have what we would call a users group, people that were, big businesses that would use the software product I was selling, and they would be active on the board of a users group. And it's great because they would tell you who the competitors were that were coming up out of the woodwork that you hadn't heard of yet. They would tell you what innovations they needed. Just the best source of information anywhere if you have a good conversational system set up to communicate with your customers. Call them the board of advisors if you want. Call them anything. Users group, whatever. Let me go on to Section 7, the last section. These three things are stipulated in the rules as being the minimum information that you need to disclose in Section 7. You probably already know if you've read the rules. How many people here were at the workshop I did back in early December on preparing your financial projections? Just a show of hands. Only a couple of you. Okay. I did that workshop because of feedback I got last year that it was an area that people really needed help on. And so we really drilled down that evening, a lot more than I have time for tonight, but I still want to walk you through all three of these items. This pointer doesn't work. Yeah. This is a simple income statement. Revenue on the top line, expenses on the middle lines, profit on the bottom line. And this is for a hypothetical company, XYZ Corporation, that one of your teams is going to launch when they graduate in May of 2013. And so they've projected sales going up by $2,000 each month, starting in May, 2,000, 4,000, 6,000, 8,000. You always show cost of goods sold as your first expense item, so that's why that's on this line. And to make it easy, we just made it 50% of what the sales were. Then you show fixed expenses, like if you're paying rent or stuff like that, whatever kind of fixed costs you have. And then you show depreciation. And depreciation is really sort of insider terminology for money you've already spent to buy a piece of equipment, capital expense for something you bought, and then you show the expense not on the day you bought it, but over its useful life. So if its useful life is 3 years, 36 months, you show 1/36 of that amount every month for 36 months, even though you paid for it up front. That's all depreciation is. And then you show your salaries, wages, benefits, that sort of thing. Total it up, subtract it from the sales, and that's your profit or loss on the bottom line. So this company breaks even in October, goes from red to black. It has a total loss for the year 2013 of $6,000. Then they keep growing and they make money the next 2 years.
What if your product is taking the licensing angle? You still need to maybe determine projections for that, that potential licensee, or how would that work?
Your revenue will be from licenses. Yeah. Well, that's like same idea as my software model here. Sales could be of licenses. Sales could be of advertising. Sales could be of whatever it is. So that works. Yeah. But the question is, when you've done this and you see you lost $6,000 the first year, how much capital do I need to raise to fund this? Can you answer that question by looking at the income statement? Can you figure out how much capital you need? How much capital would you try and raise to start this company? You know it's going to break even in October. Anybody want to guess? There's no right or wrong answer, by the way.
270 grand.
270 grand. You're going to lose 6,000. Okay, go. What's another guess between 200 and 270 grand?
36,000.
36,000. You could raise 36,000.
Could you bootstrap it? It's not a huge loss.
How would you bootstrap it? I like your approach. Do you have an example of how you'd bootstrap it?
Well, I mean, if I look at that, it says that if the cash is coming in, I really only need $6,000 to make expenses the first year. So I need $6,000.
Well, actually, you need this much the first month, and then you got to accumulate these. It's a little bit more than 6.
Yeah, you're right.
But you're thinking along the right lines. I mean, if you could make advanced sales, if you could sell gift cards before you have a product to redeem them for, there are a lot of ways you can do this. If instead of paying the cost of goods sold to the person that's providing them, you say, well, I'll pay you next year. Not that they would agree to that, but you got to be creative in financing these things. But the real answer is this is an income statement that's based on generally accepted accounting principles, sometimes called GAAP, G-A-A-P, generally accepted accounting principles. And that's the way you have to report your income statement. But it doesn't help you because it's not cash. And there are 3 lines on here. They're going to change when I turn this into a cash flow. And I highlighted them. And that is the top line. You may not be able to collect, particularly on a B2B application, business to business. You're not going to be able to collect right away. You make a sale in May, and I'm assuming it's a 60-day collection cycle here. So the 2,000 in May, you collect in July. The 4,000 in June, you collect in August. Everything slides over 2 months. I've also assumed you don't have to pay for your cost of goods sold up front, that you can pay for them on a net 30 basis on a credit card or whatever, pay the next month. So that slides out 1 month. And then I've also adjusted the depreciation, which is really something you already spent up front for your, I have $9,000 worth of furniture, phones, PC network, whatever you need to buy. For $9,000, then I divide that 9 by 36 months, and that's the way I was depreciating it. But really, you need the money up front here. And so on a cash flow basis, you're negative $14,000 in the first month, if you do it right. And instead of negative $6,000 for the year, which we saw on the income statement, now for 2013, you're negative $35,000. That was somebody's guess, right? $35,000 to finance this company. That's really, in a way, maybe the right answer. $35,000 should be able to get all they get. This is the next year. Yeah, you might be able to get by with $35,000, but it's again, there's no right or wrong answer. I'd taken an entrepreneurship course in my MBA program at Stanford, and the professor said that if you don't know how much to raise, to use a rule of thumb that had worked for him in a lot of Silicon Valley startups, which is figure out your total cash needs, multiply it times 2. So you got a cushion. You got twice as much as you're really going to need. And so I figured $250,000 was my break even for my first startup, so I raised $500,000, and I ended up going through $480,000 before I broke even. But then I was profitable and I was fine. So the 2 times formula worked for me on that first software company. But again, it depends on the business and structure of it. Sometimes you can bootstrap it, sometimes you can't. But you need to come up with some rationale, because one of the questions, going back to the first slide on what's required, is how much capital do you want to raise? And we want everybody to have thought that through, to figure out what they think they need to raise.
But you didn't include in this analysis the additional capital to open the doors?
Yeah, I think I did.
But I'm saying in here, you've got sales ready to come in. So you're saying it's only going to take 2 months to get...
Yeah, no, I didn't open the doors until I had a product to sell. And that was on purpose. You should not launch your product and start taking a salary. You should be working nights and weekends while you're a student, even if you have another job. You shouldn't leave your day job where you're working for someone else until you're ready to launch. And then you can launch, and you can hopefully get some sales right at the beginning and start paying your salary, because you just walked out of your old job when you launched the new business. So you want to get everything ready to go in advance. And it's great to do it while you're in school. I wish I'd started the business when I was in school. We had a speaker, 2 speakers last night at the Hoffman lecture, both of whom started their businesses while they were students. And they both have enormously successful businesses today worth, tens of millions of dollars. Still very young people.
The capital that you're suggesting that we need from a cash flow standpoint, shouldn't that also account for the cash flow that would be required to open?
Yes, and that's going to be my next slide. You're a very good show. That leads right into the last slide, where you see there are 3 parts of cash flow, and accountants somehow come up with these 3 terms. They call these 3 activities operating activities, which comes off your income statement, investing activities, which is money you spend on capital purchases, and financing activities. And then you add up all 3. Financing is raising money from the outside, from investors. So that's the one that's missing. Thank you. So obviously, let me go back to the previous one. You can't survive with all this negative red ink down here on the bottom line. You've got to have some money coming in somewhere to cover that. And so the financing activities I've proposed, I've got $60,000, $25,000 from winning the GWBizPlan competition, $10,000 from the founders, for their friends and family, and $25,000 from outside investors. Turns out to be a pretty good deal, because for putting in $10,000, they actually own 29% of the company, and they're really leveraging the fact that they're going to borrow $10,000 on a bank loan using their receivables. I got $10,000 in receivables here as a line of secured on a line of credit from a bank. You can use debt, in other words. You don't have to use equity when you're raising money. And this is debt. Everybody understand the difference between debt and equity? Debt you got to pay back, usually with interest if it's a bank loan or something like that, which it usually is. Equity you don't have to pay back, but they own part of your business. They get paid back when you do your exit. Maybe they do very well. Maybe they lose it all. Depends on how your business does. So basically I've come up with a scheme where, let's see, this was 60 plus 10 is 70. 70,000. That was 2 times the 35,000 cumulative negative cash flow. So I took my old professor's approach, raising twice as much. So I've got a cushion in there. So that if stuff goes wrong, and it always does, you don't know what it's going to be, you've got a cushion to adjust for that. When I started my first business, my projections were breaking even in 8 months and going through $250,000 of cash burn before I broke even. And it turns out I did break even in 8 months, but I went through, as I said before, $450,000 of negative cash flow because some things went wrong. But I'd raised 2x, and so I skated through and made it. So it's a little bit of an art form. You have to make that calculation based on what you think the volatility is and the risk profile of the business that you're starting. Balance sheet, assets on one side, liabilities and capital on the other side. We don't require this as part of your business plan, but it's the other major type of financial report other than a income statement and a cash flow. But we do require the income statement and cash flow. And then when it comes to the total amount of capital, which we ask you to come up with, you're going to have to come up with how much is going to come from the founders and how much is going to come up from outsiders.
Is sweat equity realized anywhere?
Yeah. You should. If you're not taking a salary, you should be earning stock options or shares of restricted stock. That's a different conversation. But yeah, you definitely need to be compensated for your sweat equity. Also, by getting founder shares up front that you pay very little for, then when you raise money from outsiders, they're going to pay more per share because the company is now that much further along. And so the shares are worth that much more. So that's another angle you can play. There are a lot of ways to increase your equity holdings. On my first startup, when I put in $2,000 out of $500,000, it didn't look like I had much. But I also got a lot of options, a lot of restricted stock. By the time I sold it, I owned 90+% of it. So, I mean, there are a lot of ways you can do that. March 18th at midnight is the next deadline. 15 pages of text plus up to 5 pages of appendices. You can use the appendices for anything like a big spreadsheet. If you want to do something on financial projections that's big, that could go in an appendix. But if it's a small table or something, you can just embed it right in your first 15 pages. And that way the reader doesn't have to flip back to the appendix to see it. I'm sure you'll figure that part out.
You're not notifying on April Fool's Day?
I'm sorry?
You're not going to notify winners on April Fool's Day?
Yeah. I believe it's 9 a.m. on the morning of April 2nd that the notifications will be out. The judges meet for dinner on the 1st to make the decisions. So hopefully we'll have a word to you. But my goal is that if you learn enough tonight Like you learned from Kevin May's talk on executive summaries, and obviously you all did learn enough from that because you made it to the semifinals. But if you learn enough tonight, now you go from the semifinals to the finals with your 15-page business plans. So thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you.